Number 10. Washrooms. Imagine stepping inside a castle, expecting the grandeur of medieval majesty, only to be greeted by a combination of communal bench toilets and the worst smell one could possibly imagine. Welcome to medieval times. Privacy was a foreign concept, so you better get comfortable with your mates. And when it came to waste disposal strategies in medieval times, well, it was quite simple. Chuck it down the cesspool and hope for the best. Throw it away and don't turn back. Now, the location of said cesspool, that really matters when you're building a castle. Take the Erfurt disaster, for example. In 1184 in Erfurt, Germany, at least 60 people, many which of high nobility, are thought to have drowned by falling into a deep cesspool. How horrible is that? They were immersed in politics. They were negotiating a peace treaty when all of a sudden, the floor collapsed. I couldn't imagine a worse way to go out, really. That one stinks. Number 9. Bathing. Bathing was a medieval quest in itself, with fresh water and bathtubs being a rare commodity. It also didn't help that diseases at the time were frolicking freely amongst the lower class, turning the castle into a nest of disease. For the nobility, wooden tubs draped in linens were filled with steaming water, scented with herbs and flowers. This was the best they could do at the time, a bath with flowers in it. It's the worst bath bomb ever, my gosh. Servants would fetch water that's been heated over open fires, a testament to the labor behind every drop of warmth, and for many, bathing remained a distant dream inside of these stone fortresses. Most of the time you're going to bed pretty stinky. Number 8. Crowded. Castles were always pretty crowded, believe it or not. For those who prefer a fortress of solitude, the bustling life of a medieval castle might not have been for you. Castles require a considerable workforce to manage daily tasks. They were populated not only by numerous servants, but also by extensive families of the lords and ladies. This could span generations and get pretty crowded. Because let's be honest, if you knew somebody with a castle, you would beg them to move in. Let me clean the floors, I don't care, just take me in, give me a corner. This inevitably led to crowded living conditions, and the presence of both servants and a vast array of family members made the concept of privacy, well, virtually non-existent in a medieval castle. Number 7. Dungeons. Below the bustling depths of medieval castles lay the dungeons. It's exactly what it sounds like. Realms of dread where you never saw the light of day. These medieval chambers were full of despair and darkness. Dungeons were these dark prisons that were damp, airless, and essentially forgotten by the world above. The air was thick with the scent of decay and waste. Now let's say it's the Dark Ages and you were taken as a prisoner of war. Well, if you were nobility, you got personal quarters with a fireplace and you were eating meat and drinking wine. It wasn't the worst at all. If you're lucky, they might give you a wooden bucket full of water to wash yourself up while you wait, and even a chamber pot. If you were a commoner, on the other hand, this was a little different. At most, the church guaranteed your survival, but you still stayed in a dungeon until hostilities were over and prisoners were exchanged, so a lot less meat in that one. You'll get bread and water, but you may also be put to work, so it's gonna suck either way you spin it. Number 6. Punishments. What are some of the worst ways to be punished in a medieval castle, you ask? Well, let's do it. I feel like just being locked in the dark is scary enough, but I couldn't imagine the rat punishment. Oh boy, the rat punishment is not for the faint-hearted. If you've seen Game of Thrones, you'll know exactly where I'm going here. Rat punishment involves placing a single rat inside a steel bucket. Now, this bucket would be held against the prisoner, usually over their abdomen, which already I bet is very uncomfortable and rather terrifying. But once the bucket begins to heat up, well, that's when the real trouble begins. Desperate to escape the heating container, the rat will begin to burrow through the only soft surface that it can find in order to survive, which in this case was your tummy. Yeah, not great. The surface was the prisoner's flesh. Yeah, you thought Stuart Little was cute? Think again. If he was born in the Dark Ages, he would have had a horrible job. Little high, little ho.
Anyone watching have a fear of rodents? If so, then be glad you weren't around in the medieval times. This punishment would be used on a variety of prisoners, and if it wasn't stopped soon enough, they'd surely die. A prisoner would be strapped down to a table, then they'd have a slit cut into their belly. Next, rats would be placed on the victim and covered with a bowl, and on top of the bowl would be burning hot coals. This would cause things to get a little too hot for the rats, who would start getting desperate to escape, and they'd have nowhere to go but down. They'd start gnawing at the victim's stomach, trying to burrow into it. Not only would this be incredibly painful, but disgusting and horrifying as well. Nasty dungeon rats trying to claw their way into your body, just horrific. This wasn't just used as a form of punishment either, it was also great for interrogation. I mean, try holding on to information when you have rats tunneling into your bowels. So what would happen if you made counterfeit money back in the day? Well, surely that would just land you some time in the slammer, right? Maybe a big fine. No, you'd be boiled alive. Pretty self-explanatory. You'd be placed in a big pot of hot liquid, water, oil, sometimes even molten lead, and then you'd slowly get cooked alive. This was actually a practice used across different cultures. In the Holy Roman Empire, for example, coin forgers would often find themselves boiled to death. In Britain, King Henry VIII used it for those who'd killed someone using poison. Now, this was brutal as it sounds. The heat would sear through the skin, burning limbs and organs. Sometimes the liquid wasn't even boiling when the person was put in initially, just drawing things out even longer, slowly and slowly boiling to death. For anyone enduring this punishment, death wouldn't come soon enough. The agony was prolonged, and even if they tried to speed it up by submerging their head, it was still a slow and painful end, usually taking hours. Yikes. This one goes out to all you claustrophobics out there. Immurement, which is to build someone into an enclosed space. It's basically live entombment. Immurement has been known to happen all over the world in different periods of time, but this was especially a thing in Christendom during the medieval times. The punishment was used as a form of religious punishment for the worst of crimes. The victim would be placed in a confined area, usually a room or a wall, and then brick or stone would be built around them, sealing them into the area. It was rare for the victim to ever be let out, so they'd slowly die inside the enclosed space. Yeah, this one is pretty much the definition of a make your skin crawl punishment. Anything where you're just trapped inside a small confined space is just the worst to me, like being buried alive. This would be a more drawn out death though. There'd be more air than in a coffin 6 feet underground, but not enough. It would slowly get harder and harder to breathe. On top of that, thirst and starvation would kick in. You'd probably be wishing they'd have put you out of your misery in a more violent but quicker way. Being drawn and quartered was one of the most brutal punishments in the medieval times. First, the person would be tied to a wooden frame or cart and dragged with horses through the streets. This was the drawn part. It was meant to publicly shame and humiliate them, as well as bring them to their final destination, and here's where things got even worse. They'd be hanged by the neck, but not to the point of death. Instead, they'd be cut down while still alive, and now comes the quartered part. Their body would be sliced open, usually at the abdomen, and their entrails would be pulled out. Sometimes these would be burned right in front of them. Finally, their body would be divided into various parts, and each one would be taken to a different place to be displayed as a warning to others. People who'd committed treason were usually the ones who'd have this to look forward to. Take William Wallace, for example, who was punished for leading the fight for Scottish freedom by being drawn by 4 horses, one attached to each limb. Then the rest went pretty much the same way I just outlined.
Let's start off with kind of a no-dust statement, but plagues were kind of rampant. Towns, cities, armies, navies, they could all lose a large fraction of people from what many viewed as an apocalyptic act of God. Sanitation wasn't actually the issue, by the way. Even peasants had access to soaps, outhouses, and teeth-cleaning mints. The issue was that malnutrition, pseudoscience, medical practices, and a general lack of experience against the variety of new plagues made treatment kind of difficult. So nowadays we all know what germs are because we can see them with microscopes. Back then, the answer to stop paninis included hunting down non-Christians, hunting down black cats, hunting down vampiric witches. You get where I'm going with this. And also praying. Yes, they did quarantine people, but it didn't work as well as you want when you've got people catapulting plagues into enemy cities to intentionally spread plagues. Speaking of that medicine that was not as effective as modern medicine, some of the proposed cures for day-to-day ailments were kind of wacky. For example, cobwebs were used to treat warts, and ale was made of crushed and roasted eggshells, leaves, and petals of marigold flowers. Yeah, that's how they treated plagues, which, yeah, to nobody's surprise, didn't work too well. If a medieval soldier was wounded in battle, he didn't have to worry. As soon as somebody got cut, a doctor, following the recommendations of the king's personal surgeon, would whip out his hoo-ha and pee on your wound. And this wasn't just for like fresh cuts either. Fresh urine was used to treat sores, burns, bites, and well, anything you could think of. It was gross, but apparently it worked. The ammonia in the urine would help keep cuts from getting infected, and in life or death situations, it's worth it. I know people still do that today in like survival situations, so like I get it, but when a British family had filled their chamber pots and stuffed their house with waste and rotting foods, well, they were expected to clean it out. Now officially, they were supposed to gather up their whole mess and carry outside city limits, which was one of those ideas that sounded great on paper, but in practice, nobody was about to waste their time doing that when there was a perfectly good street to dump things right outside their front door. Trash piled up in front of people's homes, ranging from old chicken bones to emptied out chamber pots. Legend has it that people dumped their chamber pots out of their windows so often that chivalrous men were expected to let women walk on the inside of the sidewalk so that any raining feces would fall on their head instead. Oh, chivalry. Nobody even tried to stop people from dumping things on the streets until the 14th century, when King Edward II introduced England's first law against dumping poop on the road. Even then, though, it didn't really have much of an effect. The trash kept piling up and people just adjusted. Wealthy people would carry perfumed cloths against their nose whenever they stepped outside to keep from upchucking, and the king started hiring professionals to clear the filth off the road. And as awful as the roads smelled on an average day, they were so much worse after it rained because, well, these roads were made of dirt, cobblestone, and they were designed to slope into a rainwater ditch in the middle of the road to prevent flooding. This would have been great if it weren't for all the trash. So all of these rainwater ditches were stuffed full of trash. So by the time it actually rained, they were useless. Instead of stopping floods, these clogged ditches would overflow and that would dislodge the months of trash that built up, which I'm sure you can guess, so gross. And when the sky eventually cleared up, the roads would be covered in wet trash and feces, slowly drying in the sun and stinking up the entire town. We're moving on before I upchuck. Unless you were wealthy, most homes in medieval England didn't actually have floors. Beneath a lot of folks' feet was nothing more than compacted earth covered in rushes, herbs, and grass. Covering the dirt with plants did help to keep the house warm, but it was very expensive. Also, food would fall into rushes and get buried there, luring rats and insects into homes. And it wasn't like anybody really had the time to deep clean. Usually they'd clear out the top layer and put on something new, but the bottom layer, where all the disgusting things was, it would stay untouched, often for decades. One Dutch visitor complained that English homes were harboring vomiting, the leakage of dogs and men, ale droppings, scraps of fish, and other abominations not fit to be mentioned. Yep, moving on. I know I've already covered stinky places today, but few places stank worse than the River Thames. During the Middle Ages, it was considered normal practice for butchers to gather up all their unused, rotten meat, bundle it up, drag it out to the bridge, and dump it in the river. This was so common that the bridge earned itself the nickname Butcher's Bridge, and it was the most disgusting place in the whole country. It was famous for being covered in dried redness and pieces of animal entrails that had spilled out of butchers' carts. It took until the 19th century before anybody put an end to the stench. But for 500 years, London's Great River was one of the smelliest places on earth. Growing old was a challenge back then. Only about a third of everybody born reached adulthood, and giving birth was extremely dangerous, with mothers, offspring, or both not making it out alive. Across society at that time, the average life expectancy was only about 35 years. Men usually lived a little longer than women, and the rich, of course, often lived much longer than the poor. Still, it's pretty wild that giving birth was more risky than going into battle. How about we start off with the first thing that popped into my mind? Animal court. Yep, Fido and Mittens could be dragged in front of a criminal court back in the day if they didn't follow animal law. There are records of at least 85 animal trials that took place during medieval times, and the tales vary from the tragic to the absurd. By far the most serial offenders were pigs, accused and convicted of chewing off body parts and even eating tiny humans. Most were found guilty and sentenced to the rope necklace or even being burned at the stake like traditional witches. In 1386, a convicted pig was dressed in a waistcoat, gloves, drawers, and a human mask for its execution. Granted, it wasn't just pigs that felt the hand of the law though. In 1474, a court found a rooster guilty of the unnatural crime of laying an egg. Unwanted rats often found themselves on the receiving end of a strongly worded letter asking them to get the heck out. And curiously enough, there was a trial of dolphins in Marseille in 1596. Granted, not all the trials ended in brutality. One donkey, which found herself the victim of unwanted advances, was proclaimed innocent after a strong recommendation from a commons prior, declaring her to be a virtuous and well-behaved animal. Hey look, if anybody wants to hold court for modern dogs that chew up furniture, be my guest. I don't think much surprises me anymore. Well, let's see. Has anybody heard about the dead Pope trial? Alright, picture the late 800s, a tumultuous time for popes as Charlemagne's once mighty empire crumbled into scattered different areas, each eyeing Rome's treasury. The papacy weakened, sought alliances with secular leaders to maintain influence. Enter Bishop Formosus of Portus, a rising figure in Catholic circles, managing church matters across Europe. Despite commendable work, this bishop found himself on the wrong side of political disputes. Accused of crimes under church law, he was convicted, defrocked, and excommunicated by Pope John VIII. But, in the intricate dance of medieval politics, his excommunication was lifted 6 years later. Released from his oath, he returned to his diocese and in a twist of fate, became Pope in 891. When he died in 896, his legacy remained tangled in political webs. Enter Pope Stephen VI, pressured by folks who harbored a grudge against the previous pope. The infamous Cadaver Synod unfolded, a grotesque spectacle where the previous pope's rotting corpse was put on trial. Now Pope Stephen appointed himself prosecutor, hurling insults at the lifeless remains, accusing the former pope of posthumous crimes. The charges ranged from performing bishop duties after promising not to, assuming the papacy, to conspiring against a previous pope. In a macabre climax, the 3 fingers used for blessings were hacked off, the papal crown removed, and the body tossed into the Tiber River. The aftermath saw monks retrieving the corpse, rumors of miraculous events, and local bishops staging a Vatican coup. Decrees of the Cadaver Synod were annulled, reinstated, and the bones were shuffled between resting places. So hopefully the poor guy is finally resting in peace, because that's just wild. Y'all have heard about trial by combat, right? Even though it was technically first practiced by Germanic peoples, it was sometimes used to settle disputes in medieval Europe. Not everybody was allowed to fight, but there are records of monasteries fighting other monasteries and wives fighting their husbands. Generally the loser would be executed, but this didn't always happen. In 979, the royal court in the Holy Roman Empire set up a trial by combat between Count Gero of Elseben and a Saxon named Waldo. The historical record isn't super duper clear about why the men fought, but Waldo brought some kind of charge against Gero, and Gero was arrested. Look, back in the day you didn't need a million pages of evidence and Harvey Specter to win a case, okay? So in the battle, Gero cut Waldo's neck, but Waldo disabled Gero with a blow to the head, winning the fight. Right after beating Gero, however, Waldo collapsed dead. So you'd think dying would have ruined Waldo's victory, but the judges still insisted that the dead man won. Since Gero was a technical loser, Emperor Otto II ordered for the count to be decapitated, so nobody really won this one. If you thought we were gonna make it through today without a single witchcraft case, you'd be mistaken. Stedlin of Boltingen was a Swiss farmer who lived in the municipality of Boltingen sometime between 1392 and 1406. So one year when his crop yield was better than his neighbors, rumors spread that he was a sorcerer. It was said that he only had such a good yield because he used magic to transport crops from other people's fields. He could also supposedly control the weather and caused a local woman to miscarry 7 times in a row. Eventually, Stedlin was arrested and confessed to being a sorcerer after being tormented. He claimed that he was in contact with demons, and those demons would summon thunderstorms after he tossed a black chicken up into the air. As for his neighbor's trouble with bearing offspring, he said her infertility was the result of a lizard he buried on her property. He also revealed that his wife was a witch and recommended that the authorities not believe her if she said otherwise. For his confession, this man was burned at the stake, while his wife got the same punishment for not confessing. So, damned if you do, damned if you don't, damned all around. I think we're gonna hit on all of the old expressions today, so we might as well get trial by fire out of the way now. In late 15th century Florence, the Dominican preacher and reformer Girolamo Savonarola was one of the most powerful men in the city. He attacked the government and the Catholic Church, and also claimed to be a prophet in touch with God. In 1494, Florence became a democratic republic, and Savonarola became its new leader. Didn't last long though. 3 years later, Savonarola was excommunicated by the Pope for his rebellious behavior and preaching. So the next year, a rival named Francesco da Puglia challenged Savonarola to a trial by fire to prove that the Pope was correct to banish him. The logic of the trial was this: if Savonarola could walk through fire without being burned, then it would show that God was on his side and the Pope was wrong. So the trial was held on April 7th. A crowd gathered to watch the spectacle, because, why not? What else are you gonna do? But Savonarola and his supporters ended up arguing with the other side until a thunderstorm broke out and put out the fire. So after that fiasco, Savonarola was arrested, confessed to being a false prophet, and was sentenced to the rope necklace with 2 of his supporters. Next up, we have a case of somebody just trying to make a damn living. John Reichener was a 14th century Londoner who lived quite the double life. Not Hannah Montana style, but just wait. He was a playboy who had very fun encounters with countless women, for pleasure, but he also dressed up as a woman and worked as a lady of the night under the name Eleanor. Sadly, one day John was picked up by city officials after being caught with a client in a stall in the street. The client told authorities that he paid for intercourse with John, but had no idea that John was, biologically male. John, dressed as Eleanor, admitted the truth of the situation and then turned over a pretty embarrassing list of other men he'd slept with for money. 3 of John's clients were aristocratic scholars, and many of the others were chaplains, friars, and priests, which that goes against their vows. John seemed to have a thing for holy people, because he also slept with nuns for free while dressed as a man, because you gotta be charitable about it. Sadly, there aren't any records about what happened to him after his arrest, But if he wasn't let go for his embarrassing testimony, he was probably convicted of sodomy.
Such as the forbidden omelette. It's not really an omelette actually, it's more like if you cut a pancake-like slab out of the color canary yellow. Back in medieval times, Lent and the other billion days they spent fasting were a miserable affair where Christians ate like lentils and dried fish every day for a month. The English came up with a solution for this tiresome diet, the tansy, a sweet and savory dish that was somewhere between a pancake and a vegan omelette. Tansies took their name from the Tantatum vulgare herb that grew across the country at that time in great abundance. Eventually a lot more ingredients were added to tansies such as parsley, feverfew, almonds, breadcrumbs, nutmeg, cream, and butter. Ironically, despite the love of tansies and the fact this plant was used to treat medical ailments, it was later discovered to be poisonous. Dangerous to consume, rub on skin, the whole 9 yards of poison. Hilariously, that did not stop the English from quite literally driving it to extinction. No more tansies now. And what could possibly be more tasty than something that you can make laxatives out of, perfume, and car oil? It's whale vomit. Ambergris is often considered as one of the world's strangest natural occurrences, and it's been used as an ingredient in food and drink alone for hundreds of years. Europeans used ambergris as medication for headaches, colds, epilepsy, and other ailments. The first reported use of ambergris in perfumery comes from Muslim Spain. It has been used for flavoring everything from cigarettes to Turkish coffee and even hot chocolate. If you like the TV show Bob's Burgers, you may know it from their episode titled as such, where the kids find a big old chunk of it washed up ashore in their wharf town. Something that does still happen nowadays, so keep your eye out for what looks like a giant chunk of earwax at the beach. Formed in the intestinal tracts of sperm whales over decades, ambergris is a grayish-brown waxy substance that some scientists believe is produced by whales to help ease the passage of objects they have eaten that they can't digest before expelling the same way whales expel fecal waste. Usually found floating in the sea or washed up on beaches, ambergris has not only been the foodstuff of choice for royalty, but it's also been a firm favorite of the perfume industry even today thanks to its strong and lingering scent. Nowadays, ambergris has fallen out of favor as a food additive, possibly because people found out what it does and where it came from, but it's still used in the perfume industry apart from in countries where it's banned, such as Australia and the United States. Another absolutely bizarre natural occurrence they enjoyed was the open arse. The rudest entry on this list by a country mile. Open arses were actually a commonly consumed variety of apple in medieval ages, and they do not look appetizing. What is that? It looks like a Photoshop project of a potato, persimmon, and a crab apple put together. I would say don't judge a book by its cover, but the inside is an effing mess too. Look at that. Who thought that was edible? Who said, look, that looks tasty, give me a bite? Literally has the composition of a moldy peach. According to the interwebs, the apple got its rather vulgar nickname from its appearance of the underside. The calces, which normally look like this on an apple, are very large, and they're spread apart on an open arse, giving the underside of an apple a distinctly certain exit human appearance. Somehow, looking like that and being still called an open arse, the apple managed to pick up popularity in the 13th century and remain popular for cooking well into the 17th. Dying of fever or just in the mood for an inconvenient, hard-to-cook dish? Well, you may want to consider roast rodent. Those little roly-polies, hedgehogs were considered a cure for everything from sore throat to leprosy. Their fat and intestines were considered the most viable. Hedgehogs may seem like an unlikely source of nourishment for us today, not just because of their prickly spines, yet their quills didn't deter determined chefs of the past globally, especially in medieval times when they prepared roasted hedgehogs by gutting and trussing them just like pullets. The hedgehogs were then roasted, and then only after they were pressed in a towel to dry and served with camelline sauce or wrapped in pastry and then broiled again. A piece of advice: if you're trying to roast a hedgehog and it refuses to unroll, simply take the dead body and put it in hot water. Or at least that's what the recipe books say. It's gross now, it was gross then, but hell do we love it. It's fast food. Stopping for a few minutes to pick up a meat pie for lunch was as common as hitting the drive-thru today, and just as likely to give you diarrhea. Just back then, diarrhea would probably kill you. Fast food cooks were notorious for using diseased or undercooked meat or just warming up yesterday's spoiled leftovers. Again, not very different from what goes on at back at Taco Hell, or Taco Bell. Fast foods of London of the late 13th and early 14th century contained easy, portable foods much like today's Big Mac. Meat pies, hotcakes, tansies, and wafers. These meat pies, called umble pies, consisted of edible entrails from deer or wild animals, generally just scrap meat. These cook shops functioned like medieval drive-thrus where customers walked up and put an order at the window. The food was being mass prepared, then individually produced. They toss your little pie in the flames right there, pull her out a second later, and there you go, enjoy your entrails and wheat. In many urban areas, one street became known as the fast food capital for the city. In Bristol, Cook's Row catered to the customers looking for fast, tasty food. As a result of these innovative fast food kitchens, professional cooks emerged during the medieval period, employed at the great estates and in smaller shops of urban centers.
Number 5. Widowhood. Widows also had a unique status in the medieval society. They could inherit their deceased husband's property and wealth in some cases, as they had more legal rights and autonomy than married women. Like in marriage contracts, the contract might outline the rights and privileges of the widow in the event of her husband's death, which they could also include provisions for her financial support, control over certain properties, or her role in the upbringing of the children. Of course, you also keep in mind if they had also outside family members that want to get involved in, let's say, if the family was rich. Marriage contracts were formalized through the signatures of the parties involved, as well as these witnesses were often very influential figures who could testify to the validity of the contract. Number 4. Superstitions and rituals. Various superstitions and rituals surrounding medieval weddings also occurred. For example, carrying the bride over the threshold was thought to protect her from evil spirits, and certain days were considered more auspicious for weddings than others. The tradition of veiling the bride was ancient roots was believed to be protecting her from the evil eye. In some cultures, the bride's face was covered until the marriage ceremony was to ward off negative influences, as certain days and months were considered more auspicious for weddings, while others were to believe it would bring bad luck. Choosing the right time for a wedding was often influenced by astrological or religious considerations. Divination practices were sometimes employed to gain insight into the future of marriage, and this could also include reading omens, consulting oracles, or interpreting dreams leading up to the wedding day. The placement of the wedding ring on the third finger of the left hand also had symbolic significance dating back to the medieval times. It was actually believed that the vein, known as vena amoris, or the vein of love, ran directly from this finger up to the heart. Does your culture or upbringing have any specific marriages routines? Let me know in the comments. Number 3. Dowry, bride, and price. In some societies, the groom or his family was expected to pay a dowry to the bride's family as compensation for the loss of their daughter, or loss, quote unquote. In other cases, a bride price was paid by the groom to the bride's family. In this era, it's very common as it was more of a negotiation. A dowry was a transfer of parental property, wealth, or goods given to the groom and his family by the bride's family. It was essentially a gift from the bride's family to the groom, meant to contribute to the new household or to serve as a financial security for the bride. Both dowry and bride price practices varied widely across different regions and culture during medieval time. The customs and traditions associated with the practices were influenced by local norms, religious beliefs, and societal structures, as both dowry and bride price had economic implications for the families involved. These transactions were often seen as ways to establish economic stability from alliances and navigate inheritance issues. Number 2. Arranged marriages. One of the primary reasons for arranged marriages was the establishment and strengthening of political alliances. Noble families used marriages strategically to forge connections, consolidate power, and to ensure the loyalty of allies. Arranged marriages were often driven by economic factors such as an exchange of dowries and pooling of the resources. These marriages were viewed as transactional and that benefit both families financially. While romantic love was not entirely absent, it held a subordinate role in the decision-making process. Marriages were more about duty, honor, and family interest than the personal affection. Individuals, especially women, had limited to say in their choice of a spouse, and marriages were orchestrated by families, and personal feelings often took a backseat to familial and societal expectations. And finally, number 1, age of marriage. Betrothals or formal engagements were commonly in the medieval society. Therefore, a betrothal was a promise to marry, usually arranged when the individuals were actually very young. The actual marriage ceremony might even take place years later. Many marriages during the medieval period were arranged by families, often for political or economical reasons, as we know, rather than love. Noble families especially used marriages for forging alliances and to consolidate the power. And in medieval times, individuals often married a younger age compared to contemporary practices. Nobility might arrange marriages for their children as young as 12 or even when they're just babies. While commoners tended to marry to their late teens or early 20s, consent from parents or guardians were extremely crucial for a marriage to even take place. This was especially true for women, who were often considered the property of their fathers until they were given away for marriage.
Punishment number 10 is ash bath. Just saying medieval times doesn't actually mean much. Every empire and kingdom had its own respective medieval time at different times than one another. So, Persia spanned from the 6th century to the 15th century, during which time they concocted some truly heinous punishments for those who did wrong, or at least those who did wrong in the eyes of whatever crazy leader was in charge at the time. Setting the stage for long-suffering death everywhere, Persia introduced such styles as forcing people to drink molten gold, tearing people apart with trees, and drowning them in ash. This punishment was one of the worst deaths you could receive, reserved for the worst criminals and those guilty of high treason or offenses against the gods, and it was horrifying. It consisted of throwing a victim into a 75-foot tower filled with ashes. You'd break a couple of bones, but it was a soft landing. From outside the tower, large hand cranks were spun by a team of men, sending the ashes flying and disrupting the solid pile so that the victim was pushed deeper and deeper down the tower, suffocating on burnt ash until they drowned in it. If you've dipped your toes in the Bible, you may know there's quite a few people that got this sentence in there, such as a corrupt Jewish priest whose family isn't allowed to bury his remains with a bunch of sassy snaps added. However, the concubines caught planning coups against their leader on several occasions met this fate too. Punishment number 9 is the evil field. So medieval Rome is characterized by the break with Constantinople and the formation of the Papal State, with technically ongoing until its collapse, which marks the beginning of Europe's medieval period. On the topic of being buried while still breathing, the Romans also enjoyed dumping people into holes alive in their medieval times. One famous example is the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses of the hearth goddess Vesta who were sworn to chastity. However, should they break that chastity vow, they had a special acre of grass dedicated just to burying them alive. Like most deaths, Romans like to make a big show of it, and the Vestal breaking her virginity vow would naturally be the Sunday matinee. They had an entire little ritual. She'd be carried on a litter throughout the city in the nude until they reached the Campus Secularis, aka the evil field. There, an underground chamber awaited in which she'd be lowered into and sealed inside alive. There was only one ever known instance in Roman history where a Vestal Virgin wasn't slain for breaking her vows. That would be Julia Aquilia Severa, the wife, then ex-wife, then wife again, of Emperor Elagabalus. It's believed that Julia remained with him until they were killed in the year 222, but who's to say they put Julia in the ground after. Punishment number 8 is the finger cinch. China's medieval period was between the fall of the Han Dynasty in 220 CE and the fall of the Mongol Dynasty in 1368 CE. Famous in the Chinese feudal dynasty, this form of punishment was specifically made for the woman who did not obey her master's command. Master can be taken literally, should it be a concubine or a servant, but also figuratively like her parents or husband. The offenders have to put their fingers inside a specialized tool which look like interlocking combs. The device would then squeeze the fingertips, causing immense pain and loss of circulation. If the victim faints, ice water would be thrown on her as a wake-up call. The punishment would continue until the victim was deprived of all their strength. The device was prepared in every shape and size to crush the fingers of any female, so she may ultimately surrender to male prejudice. Punishment number 7 is the four witnesses. The Ottoman Empire was born very shortly, around 100 years at most, before the European medieval period started. As stated, it began when Rome broke from Constantinople, and thus it finished alongside the other European nations in the 16th century. How they punish adultery is akin to many cultures. Man cheats, no punishment. Woman cheats, world must be ending. The Ottoman criminal code did not distinguish between fornication and adultery. Zina was the word used for both, and both were unacceptable from a woman of any kind. And when caught in an alleged act of zina, in order to ensure the women were not wrongfully accused, the accusers required to produce 4 witnesses of good standing that actually observed the act of intercourse as it was happening. Imagine that. You walk in on your wife in bed with your best friend. So you have to run yelling into the streets for 4 people to come right now and see them while they're still hurriedly dressing, so you have some chance of getting her punished. However, even if you do manage to pull off 4 witnesses, if the witnesses can't be found at the time of the woman's trial, then the accusing husband will be flogged 80 stripes and ignored. So what I'm hearing is, as a cheating wife, you could essentially make the little problem go away if these 4 witnesses were to, I don't know, just casually disappear before the court date. However, on a terrifying note, the husband's second option when calling the 4 witnesses to his house is taking justice into his own hands. He can actually just kill his wife on the spot and face no punishment nor require going to court, even if the witnesses didn't see the wife cheating beforehand. Punishment number 6 is marks and tattoos. European medieval period started with the fall of Rome in 476 AD and extended to roughly 1450. Meanwhile, a fun fact, the the Americas never experienced a medieval period because a feudal system was never actually established in that hemisphere. In Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, protagonist Hester Prynne is marked with a red A to see her as an adulterer. This was practiced in a few regions of medieval Europe, such as Spain, France, even Britain. However, it was reserved for working girls and their keepers and continued well out of the medieval period until the Ancien regime. Women who committed the crime of Puritanism were branded with hot iron to show the world how frivolous they are. The working girls received a P on the arm, the booty, or the forehead, which I feel is a bit vindictive and personal. Meanwhile, the keepers were branded with an M, accompanied by a fleur-de-lis. King Charles IV even made them outlaws, stating that may all girls of joy and public women desolate from our court in said time under pain of whip and mark. After the establishment of the New World, which is out of the medieval period, but as stated, the Americas didn't have one, we see branding laws in colonies more akin to Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, such as the 1658 Plymouth Law that stated adulterers must mark every garment they own to identify them of their crime. Adulterers seen publicly without their letters were subjected to public whipping and further humiliation.
Number 10, the oldest profession in history. Alrighty folks, we're kicking off today with a nice dose of internet no words, so bear with me here. If I sound convoluted, you know why. The Middle Ages in Europe witnessed a universal paradox of tolerance and condemnation with regards to the selling of one's body services. While technically a sin because it hinged on the act of fornication, this act was recognized by the church and others as necessary, or a lesser evil. It was accepted as fact that young men would seek out sexual relations regardless of their options, and thus this profession served to protect respectable townswomen from seduction or worse. In 1358, the Grand Council of Venice declared that this field was absolutely indispensable to the world. In general, declarations proclaiming the necessity of this line of work were not quite so enthusiastic. The church didn't hesitate to denounce it as morally wrong, but as St. Augustine explained, if you expel it from society, you will unsettle everything on account of lusts. So, you gotta have it. It just wasn't exactly ideal back then. Number 9, hunting witches. Witch hunters often had their suspects stripped and publicly examined for signs of an unsightly blemish that witches were said to receive upon making their pact with Satan. Now, this devil's mark could supposedly change shape and color, and was believed to be numb and insensitive to pain. And more often than not, women were both the witches and the witch hunters. And in these cases, it was easy for even the most minor physical imperfections to be labeled as the work of the devil himself. Moles, scars, birthmarks, sores, and tattoos could all qualify, so examiners rarely came up empty-handed. If found guilty, witches would be sent through a series of trials and punishments, starting with the scold bridle. Also known as a witch's bridle, a gossip's bridle, a brank's bridle, or simply branks, this was an instrument of public humiliation. It was an iron muzzle in an iron framework that enclosed the head. Some exceptions were masks that depicted suffering, but not pleasant either way. Oh, you want me to elaborate? Alrighty folks, a bridle bit or cur plate around 5 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters in size was slid into the mouth and pressed down on the top of the tongue, often with a spike on the tongue as a compress. Ouchie. It functioned to silence the wearer from speaking entirely and cause extreme pain and physiological trauma to scare and intimidate the wearer into submission. Now, this prevented speaking and resulted in many unpleasant side effects for the wearer, including excessive salivation and fatigue in the mouth. Seeing how I've always been a chatty Cathy, I would have been sentenced to this, and my jaw hurts thinking about it. The wearer was then led around the town by a leash, and for extra humiliation, a bell could also be attached to drawing crowds. It was used as corporal punishment for other offenses, notably on female workhouse inmates, and the person to be punished was placed in a public place for additional humiliation, and who knows what else. I'm sure you can put 2 and 2 together. There's things I cannot say. Number 8, bathing in what now? Aptly named the Blood Countess, Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman and was one of the most prolific female serial killers of her time. At the end of the 16th century and beginning of the 17th, she tormented and killed up to 650 young women at her castle in what now known as Slovakia. The macabre nickname came from her apparent tendency to bathe in the redness of her victims, as she believed it would help her maintain her youthful looking skin. I'll stick to my Epsom salts and the occasional bath fizzy. Oh, and my cleansing routines. Look, I swear my one cleanser from The Ordinary might look suspicious, but it's not human redness. I just play a vampire professionally, folks. I'm not an actual one. Or maybe. Number 7, serfdom. In most Middle Ages communities, the king technically owned all the land in an area. He would lease it out to noble barons in exchange for an oath of their loyalty, and then these nobles had the freedom to govern their land and impose taxes as they pleased. Yeah, as you can expect, they were pretty brutal about it. This privilege for the few landed barons came at a great cost to the serfs. Now, this was the poor mass of people who had no land and no rights. They were essentially treated as slaves by the local nobles, and they toiled on the land and brutally worked 6 days a week from dawn until dusk. Per the feudal system, they were forced to produce crops, raise livestock and offer some value, to pay their liege lord for the use of the land. And the grind never ended. If you were born into the lower class, it was extremely likely you would remain there for your entire life. There was no social mobility or opportunity to work through one's birth position. Instead, the poor, unwashed masses simply kept working hard and toiling away with no chance of ever improving their lives. If that's not evil, I don't know what is. Number 6, getting married way too young. Yeah, medieval females obtained the status of married woman very early. At the age of a girl reached the age of majority and was entitled to marry. Now, in this scheme of things, the choice of her future husband was based entirely on her parents' will. No wonder a marriage sanctioned by the law of the church turned out to be a nightmare for many wives. Under civil law, a husband was permitted to moderately physically harm his wife. Actually, a medieval tradition advised a husband to treat his wife as a pupil. So teach her place. So a lot of desperate women, therefore, killed their husbands. The legislation of those times had detailed regulations governing punishment for women who had killed their husbands. They were sentenced to death by burning alive or burning at the stake. Kinda like a witch. Creative, but not really.